The standard teaching stops at the binding. The watchers descended, they sinned. They were imprisoned in the depths of the earth, bound until the day of great judgment. End of story. That is what you have heard, if you have heard anything at all. But the Book of Jubilees does not stop at the binding, neither does 1st Enoch, neither do the Aramaic fragments sealed at Qumran and opened in 1947. These texts describe what comes next. They describe the conditions that precede the release. They name what the watchers do when the seal breaks. And they record the signs that appear in the generation that is alive when it happens. The binding is one chapter. What follows is a different document entirely. In the next several minutes, you are going to see what those texts actually say. Not the version the Council of Laodicea wanted taught. Not the version Robert Henry Charles softened in 1902. The original language, the operational language, and you are going to decide for yourself whether those signs have appeared. If this is the kind of history that was kept out of the canon, the channel covers it every week. Subscribe before we go further. The text establishes two things about the binding in Jubilees chapter 5. First, that the watchers are sealed. Second, and this is what every popular treatment skips, that the seal has a terminus. The phrase "in the Ethiopic," preserved across the Ge'ez codices at Axum and confirmed in the Hebrew of 4 Q216, reads, "until the day of great judgment." That is not a permanent state. It is a timed detention. The text builds in an expiration, and the question it then raises and answers is what the world looks like when that terminus approaches. Jubilees chapter 23 is the answer. James Vanderkam at Notre Dame, whose 1989 translation from a broader manuscript base than Charles had available remains the academic standard, identifies chapter 23 as the text's embedded eschatological timeline. It is not poetry. It functions as a diagnostic. The text names the specific conditions that mark the generation in which the Great Judgment arrives. Here is what Jubilees 23 records. First, lifespans shorten. The text says that in the generation before the judgment, humans no longer live the full measure of years. Disease and affliction multiply. The body becomes unreliable before it should. That is the first marker. Second, generational authority collapses. Children rise against elders. The text uses precise language. The young condemn their fathers. The elders have no authority over the young. The transmission of knowledge between generations breaks down, not rebellion, which is in every generation. Something more specific, institutionalized inversion. The old cannot teach. The young will not listen. The channel of transmission itself is severed. Third, civil order fractures. Violence spreads across the land in a form that existing structures cannot contain. The text does not name empires or regions. It describes a condition, strife that does not stay local, that does not respond to the frameworks that previously managed it. Fourth, the law is abandoned by choice. Jubilees 23 says that in this generation the people have forgotten the law and the commandments, not through ignorance, but through decision. The text describes a population that knows what the foundational laws said and decided against them. The departure is active. 4 markers, named in a Hebrew text copied between 125 and 100 BCE. First, Enoch adds a 5th. Chapters 80 and 81, preserved in 11 Qumran manuscripts and confirmed in the Ge'ez tradition, describe what the text calls the disruption of the luminaries, a period in which the natural order of seasons and celestial patterns becomes irregular. The Enochic calendar embedded this tension directly into its eschatological framework. Disruption of expected natural patterns is not background noise in the text, it is a classified sign. Margaret Barker, former president of the Society for Old Testament Study, has published extensively on how the astronomical and ecological language in Second Temple apocalyptic literature maps onto specific observable conditions rather than serving as symbolic decoration. These texts are not impressionistic, they are operational. Here is what no institutional teaching ever covered. The Watchers are not simply released at the moment of judgment. The texts describe a sequence, and that sequence begins before the judgment, not at the moment of it. First, Enoch chapter 56 is the key passage. Preserved in the Ge'ez tradition and confirmed in structure by the Qumran material, it describes the kings of the earth assembling in a final confrontation. Within that passage, Azazel, the leader of the first descent, appears as active in the final events, not already condemned. Active. But there is a distinction in the text that is almost never discussed. It is the most precise and most consistently ignored detail in the entire tradition. The Watchers were spiritual beings who took physical form. Their offspring, the Nephilim, died in the flood. But when a spiritual being generates a physical offspring and that offspring dies, the Enochic text is explicit about what remains. The spirit that came from the Watcher has no body to return to. It becomes, in the language of 1 Enoch 15:8, an evil spirit upon the earth. It proceeds from the bodies. It does not return to the heavens. It does not enter the binding with the Watcher. It remains active. The Ge'ez text reads, "And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth." Present tense, active state, never bound. Florentino Garcia Martinez at the University of Groningen, working on Yosef Milik's unpublished Aramaic notes from the Qumran Watchers material, notes Milik held privately for 4 decades before his death in 2006, has confirmed that this distinction is preserved in the Aramaic fragments with the same precision as the Ge'ez. The spirits are categorically separate from the binding. They were never in the chamber. This is what the texts say is already in motion, not the Watchers themselves, what they left behind when they were sealed. The Book of Giants, preserved in Aramaic in 4 Q530, 4 Q531, and 4 Q532. Fragments never part of the Ethiopian tradition, sealed at Qumran until 1947, opened in jars by Bedouin in the Judean desert, contains visions the giants received before they were destroyed in the flood. Those visions describe tablets of judgment. They describe a sequence in which the final reckoning is preceded by a period of unchecked destruction. The giants saw it coming before the flood. The text recorded what they saw. That text was sealed in a cave for 2,000 years and opened in the mid-20th century. The witness chain for the release mechanics is the same structure as the witness chain for the binding. 4 independent witnesses, 3 languages, the same operational picture. If this analysis is useful to you, share it with someone who wants to see the primary sources directly. What follows is the part the institutional record has the most difficulty with. Jubilees 23 names for diagnostic conditions. Let me be precise about what I am and am not saying. I am not saying these conditions are unique to the present moment. Every generation since the text was written has produced voices claiming the signs were fulfilled in their time. Origen in the 3rd century, Augustine in the 4th, Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th. Each identified markers from their era that matched some version of the conditions the text names. That observation is legitimate and it should create caution. What the texts do not allow for is indefinite postponement. The Jubilee calendar built into the text's own structure has internal logic. The binding occurred in a specific Jubilee cycle. The release is tied to the day of great judgment, which the text presents as a real future event, not a symbol deferred without end. The calendar is still running under the text's own framework. 2,100 years of Jubilee cycles have elapsed since the composition of the manuscript record that names these conditions. The question the text poses, not this channel, the text, is whether a specific convergence of conditions has appeared, not partial fulfillment in one region, not intermittent evidence across decades. The simultaneous presence of all four markers the text names at the scale the text describes. First marker, lifespans shortened or disrupted relative to expectation across multiple populations simultaneously. Pull the post-2020 actuarial data from the UK, the US, Germany, and Australia. That data is public. The disruption is not regional. Second marker, institutionalized inversion of generational transmission, not rebellion, which is always present, but the cultural establishment of the young condemning elders as a formal posture, not a fringe phenomenon, a mainstream institutional one in multiple societies simultaneously. Third marker, violence that spreads faster than existing containment frameworks can manage across multiple regions simultaneously, not reducible to one conflict or one political failure. Fourth marker, the active, chosen departure from foundational law across populations that historically preserved it. The texts do not grade on a curve, they describe a condition, not a trend. The diagnostic is either met or it is not. I am giving you the four markers the text names. You have access to the same present you do. Here is what the manuscript record shows. The Book of Jubilees was excluded from the Western biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. It survived in Ge'ez at Axum. It survived in Hebrew and Aramaic at Qumran. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were opened, 15 separate copies surfaced, more copies than most books that made it into the Old Testament. The text the church removed describes a binding. It also describes its end. It names the generation that sees the signs. It names what is already active, even while the watchers remain sealed. It names a sequence that begins before the judgment, not at the moment of it. Van der Kam's restored translation, Garcia Martinez's ongoing work on Milik's unpublished Aramaic notes, the Ge'ez codices behind locked doors in Axum, the fragments under glass at the shrine of the book in Jerusalem. Every surviving witness across every language in every century has preserved not just the binding, but what follows it. The binding is a chapter. The release conditions are what comes after, and what the texts describe as preceding the release, the spirits already in motion, the diagnostic markers, the disruption of the natural order, is not something the Qumran scribes or the Axum monks invented to fill space. They preserved it with the same fidelity they preserved the binding. Across 1,500 years, across 3 languages, across 3 continents, without drift. Next week, the Nephilim after the flood. The texts do not say they all died. Subscribe so you don't miss it.